Hello everyone and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. Today we'll be going over one of the things that people get most confused in multiplayer games, which is what happens when a player leaves the game, either because they are killed or because they choose to concede, which is specifically rule 800.4. Let's begin. So let's begin with what is the process that we follow when a player leaves the game. It's a very certain process that goes step by step. So step 1 is whenever a player leaves the game, all objects owned by that player leave the game. So by object we mean spells on the stack, copies on the stack, permanents on the battlefield, tokens, cards, emblems, and everything pretty much you can imagine leaves the game at once. Also note that it's everything that player owns, and owner is the player that started with that card in the deck, or if we are talking about something that's not a card like an emblem or a token, the player who created that emblem / token. So everything they own gets removed from the game. They leave the game with that player. Also, any effects which give the player control of any objects all players end. So here it's permanent effects like mind control or act of treason. Then, if after this whole process is completed, if the player that left the game still controls objects on the stack that are not represented by cards, those objects cease to exist. Which means essentially copies of spells. And after that, if there are any objects still controlled by that player, those objects are exiled. So let's say we have played a bribery on an opponent's creature, gotten a Thassa's Oracle from the deck, then that is exiled because we don't own it and we leave the game. So anything that after the whole process of removing anything we own is not removed, it's exiled. And by the way, what's really important is that this is not a state-based actions. It happens at the moment the player leaves the game. And then for priority issues. If the player who left the game had priority at the time they left, the priority passes to the next player in the order who is still in the game. So for some easy examples to understand this first step of how this works, let's say we play the mind control on an opponent's grizzly bear, for example, and then we leave the game. What happens is, we said the first step is everything we own leaves the game, so the mind control is the game, and then because the mind control is not longer attached to the grizzly bears, the bears reverts back to the opponent who has stolen the bears from. So that's because again the mind control is removed, so the gain control effect ends. Now, if we played instead an act of treason to gain control of that grizzly bears, then if we leave the game, the change control effect of nuclear bears ends, as we said on the second part of the process, and the bear again returns back to the original owner of the card. Now, if we had played mind control on an opponent's grizzly bears again, and they leave the game, because they leave the game, the grizzly bears they own gets exiled, and mind control, since it's an aura that no longer has a legal target, is placed into our graveyard. Also, as I mentioned before, with bribery, because we are putting a card from our opponent's deck, we are not getting control of that card. So if we leave the game, we do not own that card, and therefore after the game checks, okay, do we still control anything else? Yes, we control the grizzly bears we put into play with bribery, so we exile that grizzly bears. That could also happen by, let's say, reanimating a creature in an opponent's graveyard. It will be exiled. Now, if it is their commander, since it gets exiled, the owner of the commander gets to choose whether it stays on exile or is placed back in the command zone as a state-based action. And one final thing is that if there is an effect that would trigger, as we already said, so let's say we have Genesis Chamber, which is whenever a non-token creature is the battlefield, if it is untapped, that creature's controller creates a mirror. If we leave the game, all the tokens under our control will leave the game, but because the other players created the mirror tokens, their tokens stay in the game because it was a result of them creating tokens. So tokens leave only if they are under our creation, so only tokens we have created, because a token owner is the player who created the token. Some interesting extra things we need to know about the whole process is that if an object would change control to the control of a player who has left the game, it doesn't. So let's say we activate Zedru to give an opponent a bad enchantment we have, and another opponent kills that opponent, the enchantment stays under our control because the effect no longer has a legal target or even a player to give something to. If also the token would be created under the player's control, the token is not created. And if an object we put on the battlefield onto the stack under the control of a player who has left the game, it stays where it is in the zone it was before. So for example, if there was a reanimate effect for an opponent that another player used, then the third player left the game, then the creature would still stay in the graveyard. And if a player will be controlled by a player who has left the game, they aren't. So if they try to mind slaver you and they are dead when they would control your turn, they are not controlled, so you control your own turn. Also, here is a very interesting part that comes up not so often, but is very important to know. So let's say that we have an effect that give a player still in the game control of an object, and that effect ends, and there is no other effect giving control of that object to another player in the game, and the player who controlled the object by default has left the game, the object is exiled. So what essentially that means is, let's say I have cast a bribery on one of my other opponents. I take the creature, like a grizzly bear for example, and then a third opponent acts of the reasons that the creature. Let's say that before the end of that turn I die. So what will happen there is that because I don't own the grizzly bear, it's not currently on my battlefield, and the game control effect is from another player, that means I leave the game. At the end of the turn, the grizzly bears try to return to me because I was its controller, but I'm no longer in the game. Since I'm no longer in the game and the grizzly bears tries to return to me, the grizzly bears is exiled. It's not something that comes up very often because it's really hard to gain control of something, then another player gain control of it, and me dying at the process, but it's something you need to know. Also, something very important, that if an object will be owned by a player who has left the game, would be created in any zone, it isn't created, and the same goes for triggered abilities. So why this is important is, let's say we have something like Astra's Ride, and during our opponent's turn we cycle a card and choose to exile one of the grizzly bears, and then we die on that attack. That means that the creature that would return with Astra's Ride at the beginning of the next end step, because that's a delayed triggered ability created by the first triggered ability, needs that ability to happen in order for the creature to return. And therefore, because we have left the game, and because of that rule, that triggered ability cannot be placed on the stack, because again, remember, objects are not just tokens permanents, they are also abilities. So since the delayed triggered ability of Astra's Light cannot be placed on the stack, that means that the bear will stay in exile forever. Also, capping of that, again, if obviously combat damage will be assigned to the player who left the game, that damage is assigned, and for example that could happen if the player concedes when they are attacked, so you wouldn't get anything on what triggers on damage. And also this is again very important, that if an object requires a player who has left the game to pay a cost, or choose whether to pay a cost, that cost cannot be paid. So for example, let's say we leave the game and we drew cards during that process. Let's say for example, like an opponent has Mothering Tithe and we have 3 cards in our library, and someone played Blue Sun Zenith on us for 4. We draw the 3 cards and we lose the game because we cannot draw from our deck. Since we are drawing the cards, Smothering Strike sees the draws and will trigger, and since we have left the game by the point the triggers will be placed on the stack, we cannot choose to pay, so the opponent would get to create 3 treasures. Really important because Smothering Tithe is a very well played card. Also, on the choices part, if an effect requires a player who has left the game to make a choice except for paying costs, the controller of the object chooses another player to make that choice. So for example, if I try to cast Emergency Ultimatum and the ultimatum resolves because it does not target, I say okay, I choose you to make a choice. You cannot concede the game to make the Emergency Ultimatum no work, because then I can just pick another player to make that choice. And also, of course, if the choice requires an opponent, we must choose another opponent if possible. And if a rule would require a player who has left the game to make a choice, the next player in turn order makes a choice. That's not very relevant. Now, another very relevant thing is that if an effect requires information about a specific player, the effect uses the current information about the player if they're still in the game, otherwise their last known information before they left the game. And that's an effect like saying in the Dark Baron, which tries to see what the life total of the player that left the game was at the beginning of their turn. So that looks at the life total at the beginning of the turn. And that's how it works. I think it might be the only card that even functions under this rule. Another very important thing is that if a player who has left the game will begin a turn, they don't begin their turn at all. Also, the most important thing, because it's something I was also doing wrong because I hadn't researched this, is the following. So, what happens if a player leaves and it is their turn? Well, you might assume that the turn ends, right? That's not correct, because if a player leaves the game during their turn, that turn continues in completion without an active player. And if that active player will receive priority, the next player in turn order receives priority, or the top object of the start resolves, or the phase or the step ends, whichever is appropriate. So what that means is that, let's say on my upkeep I have an enchantment that deals 3 damage, I'm on 3 life, so I die. Then we follow the steps normally. The player after me in turn order gets priority. It's not the active player, they just get priority. And pretty much, if no one wants to respond to the changing of the phase or do something there, the phases and the steps end immediately. Also, if an opponent will have a trigger that triggers, let's say, at the beginning of the end step or the beginning of the up, those triggers happen normally. And you can cast spells during a dead player's turn, but only during the turn they left the game. After that, they obviously are removed as a turn option. Also, very important here, whenever plays the game, any continuous effects with durations that last until that specific player's next turn, or that till a specific point in the turn, will last until that turn would have begun. So this includes goading. So if a player has goaded a creature and they die before the next turn, that creature will stay goaded until that turn would have begun. So the creature is not goaded forever and the goading effect doesn't end. So it's just waits to see the point where it would have ended and then it ends. So essentially it ends after the player before that player that goaded the creature ends the turn, and before the player after the player who goaded the creature begins the turn, in a window that you cannot see in the game, but it there ends. And that's here to make sense on the rules. Otherwise, it will have to be an option to either end it immediately or last indefinitely, which both do not work correctly. And this was the whole process at what happens when a player leaves the game in a multiplayer game. Obviously, in a 1v1 game, whenever a player is the game, the other player wins. It's just simple. As you can see, in multiplayer games there are some more layers into what exactly happens. What I would keep in mind from all of this is the two important things: what happens with the permanence owned and controlled by the player, and what happens if that player dies during their turn. So take all those things you learned today and make sure to know them for the Commander Legends Baldur's Gate set, because that will be a multiplayer draft, so you need to know these things in order to make sense of the game. Hope you learned something today that was useful and that you will find use in your Commander games. Thank you all very much for watching. See you in the next video.